Hey, what's up, everybody? We are about to kick off a kombucha brewing Q&A. This is mainly for commercial kombucha brewers, but some of this information might be interesting to you if you're brewing kombucha at home or you want to know a bit more about it. I'll start by saying that the whole reason that I do these kombucha brewing Q&As is because as a brand, we believe in openness and transparency, and we basically want to connect people in the industry to each other so that there's knowledge sharing, so that there's sort of like the beer industry or the coffee industry. People are sort of sharing knowledge rather than, I just ran into the room a bit out of breath. So people are sharing knowledge rather than sort of keeping it to themselves. And even if you have the same techniques, you can never copy someone's kombucha brew. It's always going to be different, and that's the beauty of it. So the whole point of this is to pass on some of the learnings and insights that we've gained over the past 5 years, of which, you know, we don't know everything. We don't profess to, but some of the stuff that we do know in our limited experience, we're going to share with you. So there's a couple questions that I received ahead of time, and I'm going to talk through some of that stuff quickly. I've made some notes, and then if you guys have questions, just post them in the comments, and then I'll go through those and answer them in a little bit. So yeah, I hope this is helpful. So let's start with recipe development, and let's start with the primary ferment. So in terms of fermenting initially, it's different for every single person. We have a specific recipe that we use that we recommend to people brewing at home or brewing on a commercial scale. And this is what works for us. And I've talked through this before. And if anybody wants this information, by the way, I literally have everything bullet pointed on a document, so I can send that through to you. Just email me, adam@jarkombucha.com. I'm also going to go into a bit of detail about the acetator that I've discussed sort of a couple months ago, and to let everybody know that we now have a comprehensive PDF document with the entire spec for the acetator. So this is how to make starter liquid and make it non-alcoholic, make it consistent. It has all the directions. It is incredible. And it was made by our former brewer, Matthew Hoyle, who is head of production for the London Fermentory. And he's also a commercial kombucha consultant. So if you have any further questions after you take a look at that document, which you can get again by emailing me, adam@jarkombucha.com, I'll just send you the PDF and you can go through it, and you can build your own acetator at home. Or maybe not at home, but in your brewery. You can build it on a smaller scale actually at home. So our goal is to let people know that they can do all of this stuff themselves. You guys can do all of this yourself. You don't have to buy starter liquid or acid from anybody. You can make it yourself, and you can make stuff that works. It's non-alcoholic, that's super rich in bacteria, has the right amount of yeast, and it's going to kickstart your fermentation. So that's what you want, really, when it comes to commercial brewing. You want really potent bacteria-rich starter, also what we call, liquid SCOBY. So in terms of the primary ferment, just jumping into that, and we're going to post this so you can sort of follow after I speak. It's not just going to be live. Hopefully it saves this time. We recommend anywhere between 2 and 6 grams of tea. It totally depends on you. 6 grams is quite a bit of tea, so you're going to have leftover caffeine. Remember that a lot of that caffeine is consumed by the culture throughout the process. At the moment, we're using 2 grams of tea per liter. We find that serves our purposes, and it gives us the right sort of lightness, but also enough body and texture, and it also provides enough nitrogen for the bacteria and yeast. And the nitrogen is important. If ever you're having trouble with yeast growth, maybe you don't have enough yeast, maybe your kombucha is not fermenting well enough, you can add some more tea, or you can up your tea amount, and that will feed it with more nitrogen, which will speed up the process. In terms of sugar content, we recommend 50 to 60 grams per liter. And this is a point of contention. Sometimes people use 100, 120 grams of sugar, but we find that 50 is actually ideal. 60 is a good amount as well, but generally speaking, you don't really need to go above that. The starting total acidity and total titratable acidity is something you can easily test. And if you want information on how to do that, I will send you through a document on how to do that, step-by-step guide on what you need and how the process works. Again, this was made by Matt, our former brewer. So a starting TA for us of our primary ferment is about 0.10 moles per liter with a finishing total acidity of 0.14 moles per liter. And again, that's just us. That's how we work. Those are the parameters that we work towards. Our kombucha is quite acidic. It has a little bit more gluconic acid over acetic acid, so it's more like a sour apple flavor if you've tasted ours before, rather than a pure vinegar flavor, but it's very acidic. It's one of probably the most acidic on the market in the UK, so it's a bit intense, but that's sort of what we go for. That's why we call ourselves Jar. Let's see. So what I was saying, we still use the same recipe today that we used many years ago, and I've mentioned before, but we brew now in fully closed tanks. We oxygenate those tanks ourselves using ambient air. We don't actually use pure oxygen. We use ambient air from the room, from the brewery. And those go through a carb stone, a couple ports, actually, a couple carb stones. And these are 20,000 liter tanks. So that's how we do it now. But we're using the same levels of starter liquid. We're using the same levels of sugar and tea that we've always used. And it's still brewed, still takes us 10 days. In one of those giant tanks with controlled oxygenation and heating and cooling, it still takes us 10 days to ferment our kombucha. You can't speed up that process. Some people do, some people do in a couple days actually, but in our experience, it takes about 5 to 7 days to properly ferment kombucha to get that real flavor, to get that complexity that you can only get from a properly brewed drink. Just drinking this, by the way, right now. I don't know if you guys have ever tried this before. It's amazing. It's called Nunk. It's brewed in Buckinghamshire. So if anybody's in the UK, you should try this stuff. It's a June kombucha made by one of our friends. It's amazing. June is so good. So essentially, that's sort of our primary ferment. Now, in terms of starter liquid, I don't want to go into too much detail unless people are asking questions now, but I'm just going to check to see what you guys have said. Okay. So, alcohol content question. When we first started, how did we keep the alcohol below 0.5%? Have we experimented with, I'm not sure what that says, iDdjmIt2gqrSAAteyBvWra culture. I'm not sure what that means. But so the best way of controlling your alcohol content is oxygenating your kombucha and not using a cellulose SCOBY, not using the cellulose pellicle as it's called. And for those of you who are tuning in for the first time for one of these Q&As, we sort of talk about the fact that we use our liquid SCOBY, our starter liquid. We stopped using a cellulose pellicle, the pancake looking SCOBY, quite a while ago, probably, 2.5 years, 3 years ago now, something like that. And we produce the starter liquid. And what that does is it gives more oxygen to the actual bacteria, and it prioritizes bacteria growth over yeast growth. So also by agitating that liquid constantly, by bubbling oxygen into the liquid regularly, that dissipates the alcohol. So if you're brewing on a small level, removing that cellulose when it forms and stirring your kombucha manually. This is if you're using maybe 8-liter glass jars. If you're using slightly bigger tanks, you want to invest probably initially in like an aquarium pump. And I have some links to some really good quality aquarium pumps. This isn't an endorsement. I don't know these people, but they're really good. And these links in particular were actually sent to me by a brewer in Thailand. And they're amazing. So there's some really good equipment out there that you can buy, which were made initially for fish tanks, which really efficiently oxygenate reasonably small volumes of liquid, but you can get even bigger ones, which were designed for sort of large-scale aquariums. If you're using something like a bright tank, or if you're using a tank that has a port, you can also do a carb stone. And depending on the environment of your brewery, you can either use pure O2, which you can buy in cylinders. Got to be careful, that's very flammable. Or you can use the ambient oxygen that you have in your brewery, as long as there's not too much ambient yeast in the air. But oxygenating your kombucha is the best way, and removing that cellulose is the best way to keep it below 0.5% alcohol. And then on top of that, we filter our kombucha. We've been very transparent about the fact that we do this. It goes through a centrifuge, an industrial centrifuge, which is what we use nowadays, followed by an inline plate filter, which takes it to 0.45 microns, which is sterile. When we were still brewing at our London brewery, we were filtering initially with a 20 by 20 plate filter that was 10 microns, followed by a 40 by 40 plate filter that was 1 micron, followed by 2 PALL cartridge filters, which was 0.45, and that was on the way into the bottling machine where we would hand bottle. So we actually never filtered our kombucha until we had bright tanks. Somebody asked me recently how you filter your kombucha if you're doing it on a small scale. If you email me, we can sort of talk through it. Again, if you're just tuning in, Adam@jarkombucha.com. But we only started filtering when we already had a bright tank. So it makes it a hell of a lot easier. Those sort of systems work together, and they were large scale filters, which can work with corny kegs if you're using that. But ideally, you'd want some kind of carbonation tank, even if it's a reasonably small one, something that's pressurized that you can force your kombucha through in terms of to get it through the filter. So concerning the production of our starter, do we add some kind of yeast in order to consume the sugar quickly at the beginning? And if so, do we do it every time? No, we do not add any kind of yeast, but one way of speeding up the process, which is on the document, the PDF that I can send to you about the starter liquid tank, is that if you sort of turn on some kind of pump or you oxygenate liquid for maybe an hour or 2 hours prior to letting it sit for a period of time. So, sorry, just going back to what we've said months ago, when you make a starter liquid, at least in the way that we do it, and you can look at sort of the spec when I send it through to you, we leave the pump and the oxygen off for 5 days. So we'll put our kombucha or our starter kombucha prior to fermentation inside this tank, which is completely closed and not exposed to oxygen, and we leave it for 5 days. And that means the alcohol level goes up to about 3% over the course of 5 days. Then we switch our pump on, and then the liquid is oxygenated. And then that alcohol is converted very efficiently into acetic acid. So initially stimulating yeast growth or stimulating that process a little bit more efficiently, you can turn on the pump for about an hour and then turn it back off. But you can also do that manually if you're going to close off a tank. Sorry, I'm getting a bit technical here, but we don't add anything in order to speed up the process, no. Just going through the documents available from me. So just email me, Adam@jarkombucha.com, and I'll send you through the PDF that you can look through. And you can also thank Matt Hoyle for this. I don't know if any of you tuned into the Kombucha Summit, but he spoke there. He's very knowledgeable. Matt's amazing. Most of the stuff that I know about kombucha fermentation on a commercial level is from Matt, because he's such a genius when it comes to this. I'm just looking. I'm curious about how you maintain carbonation in the kombucha with the gravity filler, or do you not utilize forced carbonation? So this is a personal preference. We force carbonate. Forced carbonation, for those of you who don't know, is when you put CO2 into your kombucha, similar to any soft drink, any beer. It's the safest way of creating carbonation in kombucha. If you're doing a secondary ferment, you're immediately raising the levels above 0.5%, especially if you're adding fruit juice, if you're doing a flavored kombucha. Unless you're selling, to friends and family, then you should definitely force carbonate. And you can do that through corny kegs, or, when you get to a larger scale, you can invest in a bright tank. If you're just brewing at home, you can get a soda stream. It's how you carbonate water at home. They're like 40 pounds or, wherever you are, $40. And you can carbonate kombucha at home in that and test out the levels of fizz that you like. But doing a secondary fermentation is too risky if you're selling on a commercial level. So if you're gravity filling, you would probably need to find an optimal level of carbonation. so that it doesn't foam when you fill your bottles. But yeah, that's a tough one that you're just going to have to experiment with. How do you decide or calculate how much oxygen to introduce to your kombucha? What happens if you don't add enough? So it's difficult to say because everybody's going to do this differently. At our scale that we're doing now at our brewery, we can calculate the amount of oxygen that we're pumping into the tank, but really it's a matter of starting to understand what the levels are of your yeast and bacteria from a taste perspective initially. And you can also take samples out, and if you invest in a microscope, you can sort of see the increased proliferation of the bacteria and yeast. But there's no easy answer to determining how much oxygen you need. Again, in this PDF that I can send to you, email me, adamjarkombucha.com. It's sort of the way that we did it was quite a specific method for our tank. Depending on how big your vessel is, sort of the amount of liquid that you have in it, the makeup of your bacteria and yeast, you're going to need to experiment to determine how much oxygenation is key. Again, I've spoken about this before and I just touched on it, but with our particular starter tank, which was a 1,200 liter stainless steel fermentation tank that we customized, we would fill it about 1,000 liters. So there's about 200 liters of headspace. We'd close it completely, turn it off for 5 days, allow the alcohol levels to go up, and then switch on the pump. And we would vary it was a VFD, so we would a variable frequency drive. So we could increase or decrease the speed at which the liquid was being circulated. And there's more detail in this PDF that if you go over that after I send it to you, we can discuss the details of that over email. Carbonating agent in plain kombucha. I'm unable to get carbonation without fruit puree. Again, get a soda stream or do it in a corny keg. But you can do something if you're doing it at home and you don't have those tools. You can do something called priming, which is you can either just use sugar or you can make a simple syrup, sugar and water, and then you add that to your brew. And essentially leave that closed for a couple days and you'll get carbonation. Doing secondary fermentation of original kombucha unflavored it's difficult to achieve that fizz sort of naturally, but some brands have done it very well. One of them is Go Kombucha. And I know that they do secondary fermentation in sort of wine bottles. And they're one of the few brands that I've seen that's achieved that level of fizz in a unflavored kombucha. How can you make a non-alcoholic kombucha? Again, non-alcoholic kombucha, as I stated before, is down to removing that cellulose layer, stirring continuously, not continuously, but regularly to get as much oxygen into there as possible. Just a reminder, most of you already know this, but anytime a layer forms on top of a kombucha brew, it creates an anaerobic environment. And anaerobic is without oxygen, and that's where yeast takes over, and yeast will convert that sucrose that is in your sugar into ethanol. And so if you don't have enough oxygen in your brew, the yeast will just go nuts and create alcohol. So as long as you're feeding oxygen into your kombucha regularly, again, by stirring it in small batches or by investing in an aquarium pump, again, I can send you some links to some good ones, depending on the scale at which you're brewing, or Carbstone on a very big scale. You want to get as much oxygen into your brews as possible to keep it non-alcoholic. About the end values of your starter, what quantity of total acidity moles per liter do you have at the end of the starter production? What is the amount in pH? So I actually have this information here. So our starter liquid. Our finishing total titratable acidity of our starter liquid is between 0.5 and 0.6 moles per liter. So that's like super potent, really quite sour. If we're talking about our primary ferment, just our standard kombucha that we ferment for 10 days, we're talking a finishing TA of 0.14. So, you can see from 0.14 to 0.50, 0.60 is quite a significant jump, but you need that level of acidity in order to kickstart your fermentation process, bring the pH down below 4 to make it safe. And so that's what we work towards. The pH doesn't matter as much. The pH will generally be between 2.5 and 3, but the total acidity is much more important than the actual pH. And again, a lot of this information will be in the PDF that I can send to you. Also, some of you, I may have sent this a calculator. It's a brewing calculator that we use to calculate sort of based on the amount of sugar that we're using, the quantity of tea, and it sort of spits out exactly how much you need to use of everything in order to achieve the results you want. It's sort of an Excel brewing calculator that, again, Matt Hoyle designed. So I'm happy to send that to anybody that needs it. It's super helpful, and it also has some of our own sort of levels on there. Let's see here. Have you ever tried using a spinning cone column to control alcohol? What's your thought on it? I don't actually know what a spinning cone column is, but perhaps you mean something similar to a centrifuge, which is how we filter. There are breweries that use de-alcoholizers, so they can literally remove the alcohol from the kombucha. One of those is Brew Doctor Kombucha in Portland, Oregon. Really fascinating. They cost like £1 million though, so if anybody's got that cash floating around. Otherwise, removing the alcohol, I'm really not sure how to do that. About the process of your starter, do you initialize the starter production with a kombucha as starter, or with your liquid starter as well, and in what percentage? Also 25%. Let me pull that up because I have something about that. So I'm just going to do a quick, even though you guys will have access to this after this talk, I'm just going to talk through a couple aspects of the starter. So this is what's in the document, but the primary purpose of this starter tank is to produce fermented kombucha of a low pH, a high total titratable acidity, and a high microbial density. This is very important, especially that last point. Starter liquid or acid or liquid SCOBY, whatever you want to call it, it is useless unless it has living microbes in it. You can buy, there's companies that sell acid, that sell quote unquote starter liquid, but it's generally dead. If you look at it under a microscope, there's no living microorganisms in it. And that's fine because, it's not, it's fine in your final brew because actually, according to all the research that's out there, there are no benefits associated with the bacteria found in a finished kombucha. It's actually down to the acids and the antioxidants. So those are the only proven health benefits. But when it comes to brewing, if you need acid, you want it to have living bacteria in it. Otherwise, your kombucha is not going to ferment with it. Otherwise, it's just, it's similar to vinegar, dead vinegar that you would mix with your tea to make a tea vinegar soda. It wouldn't be properly fermented. So anyways, just went off on a tangent there. So the operation of this is essentially, and this is using our particular tank, which is, like I mentioned, 1,200 liters. We brew a sugar-sweetened tea mixture to 10 bricks with a volume of 800 liters. So you do a massive amount of 80% sweet tea that you want to be at 10 bricks. The quantity and the type of tea is not super critical, but if you don't have enough tea, it will affect the fermentation efficiency. Sort of as I've mentioned previously, you need to have enough tea to provide enough nitrogen. And the suggested quantity I spoke about previously is between 2 and 4 grams per liter. And then we inoculate this, and this is the answer to your question, with around 200 liters of existing kombucha. It doesn't need to be starter liquid, but it needs to be kombucha that has a pH of 3 or below, ideally, and a total titratable acidity, which is more important, of 0.2 moles per liter or higher. So our finished kombucha, like I mentioned, is 0.14. So you probably want to let that go a little bit longer to get to 0.20 if you're going to add that as starter for your starter, if that makes sense for you. So I'm going to stop there because you'll have access to this information after, but I hope that answers your particular question. How are you flavoring? We're flavoring with juice. We also use natural flavors to enhance the aroma. Yeah, I mean, it's totally up to you how you guys do it. We use cold pressed ginger juice. It's a Peruvian ginger root, which is much more lemony and much more fiery, and there's just so much more to it than the cheap Chinese ginger. It costs more, but you get way more juice out of it. So try that out. If you make a ginger kombucha, try investing in some Peruvian ginger root. You'll really taste the difference. It's incredible. And then we use a raspberry juice or passion fruit juice. But yeah, mess around with whatever you want. You can use dried fruit. You can use herbs, spices, all types of stuff. The June that I'm drinking has juniper in it. It's incredible. So you can flavor with anything. You know, we've talked about this before, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are already doing this. Is it possible to make a 0% alcohol kombucha? Yes, it is actually. And I sort of touched on it before, but there's de-alcoholizers. There's industrial ones that you can get. But the kombucha that we produce nowadays in Belgium is actually between 0.0 and 0.1. So it's actually 0.1 or 0.1. So it generally speaking, it's almost entirely free of alcohol, and that is due to constant oxygenation. We are constantly oxygenating our primary ferment nowadays in these big tanks that we're fermenting in through a couple of different sort of ports where we have carbonation stones. So really, the more you oxygenate, the less alcohol is going to be left. And then again, it goes through a filtration process, so our kombucha is completely ambient, and it never goes above. And again, it's a 10-day fermentation cycle for us. Is there any plan in the future you'll sell your kombucha in Indonesia? I don't know. There's some really good kombucha in Indonesia. There's one called kombuchi, I think it's called, in Canggu. So there's already some great stuff out there. So I'm not sure. Maybe one day. I asked about adding the yeast because we are trying it with closing our tank for 5 to 7 days, but it seems that our yeast just did not eat as much sugar. We're getting just about 1 Brix down. This is a bit specific, so if you want to send me an email, we can sort of talk through this and troubleshoot together. Just adam@jarkombucha.com. How does the grams per liter change between different teas we use? For example, oolong and green tea. Really, this is entirely up to the individual in terms of the amount of tea that you use. So our kombucha, if you've tasted it before, anybody out there, we use 2 grams of tea per liter at the moment, and we use a 50-50 blend of green and oolong, and we steep that for 15 minutes or so together at about 80 to 85 degrees. And we find that works well for us. Some people will steep their tea, they'll infuse it 4 times because they want to get the most out of it. It really depends. The more tea you use, the more caffeine will be left, the more of the tea flavor will be present. We go for quite a light tea flavor, but some people might like it to be a bit stronger. I have tasted a lot of kombucha where people use too much tea, or they steep their tea for too long at the wrong temperature, and that really comes through. So you do have to make sure that you're doing a little bit of a light touch when it comes to tea. Kombucha is made from tea, but you don't necessarily want it to taste like tea. It's an entirely different, thing. What kind of shelf life of a bottled kombucha do you target when force carbonating? So for us, force carbonating doesn't extend the shelf life because our kombucha is already filtered. But the interesting thing is when you remove the yeast and bacteria from kombucha, it is essentially, it's so acidic that it will last forever. You might have some slight changes to the flavor if you're using fruit juice or something like that, but at the time of production, our kombucha has a shelf life of 18 months, and we've done extensive testing, and that's only down to flavor changing. Nothing forms in that bottle. So, of course, it sells quicker than that. We've never had a bottle, run out of its shelf life at 18 months, and really, people get through them in less than 6 months. But we recommend people, enjoy their kombucha refrigerated, and don't store it in super hot temperatures because that can speed up the process of flavor degradation sort of over time, even if it's filtered. What equipment would you recommend for cold crashing if we don't want or don't have the money to invest in tanks with a conical bottom? a fridge unit or a Cornelius keg. You can, if you, it depends on the scale that you're brewing. I'm not sure, how many liters you're brewing at any given time, but if you have a fridge, chuck it in a corny keg, crash chill it that way. Or you can actually get these sort of glycol, you can get small glycol unit and these cold crashing coils. You can buy them on brewing sort of websites. You can get them from small batches to larger ones, and you can basically bring hot tea or whatever you're starting your brew with, and you can cool it down right away so that when you add your starter liquid or your SCOBY, it doesn't kill the bacteria instantly. So you can invest in these kind of coils. If you search brewing cold crashing coil or something like that, those are a good one to use. Otherwise, a fridge or a jacketed tank, those are really the only ways that I know. Or if you're referring specifically to brewing your tea, and somebody emailed me about this earlier today, so hopefully this answers that question too, but create a concentrate. Don't, if you're brewing, say, let's just say 1,000 liters, do 250 liters of a tea concentrate using the right amount of sugar, the right amount of tea, instead of doing 1,000 or 800 liters of just tea. You want to make sure that you're making a small amount so that you can cool it down, and then you can do your brew immediately, so you don't have to chill it overnight, if that makes sense. I'm sure a lot of people already know this and are already doing this. 0.5 TA is like under 2 pH, isn't it, for the starter? pH and total acidity, they don't exactly, what's the word? They're not based on each other. pH is the level of sort of acidity in the kombucha, but total acidity is the balance of all the acids. So pH is a measure of safety, whereas total acidity is much more a measure of flavor. And we're talking about 0.5 TA in moles per liter, which is a very specific measurement. But again, on this PDF that I can send you about the starter liquid tank, there's some details specifically on TA and also some details on pH, so you can look through that yourself. How much juice do you guys use? So generally speaking, actually somebody asked me today about the KBI codes of practice, and I was just looking through their different definitions of kombucha, and generally speaking, kombucha for them is defined as a tea-based ferment that contains no more than 20% juice. So, I mean, from a KBI perspective, that's how they categorize it. But generally speaking, our ginger kombucha is 2% juice. Our passion fruit, raspberry kombuchas are 5% juice. In the States, like a Health Aid or GTs, some of those are around 10% juice. It really depends. It depends how sweet you want it to be, how much of the kombucha flavor, how much of the juice flavor, sort of a balance you got to find for yourself. But yeah, just do some testing. But again, a super potent ginger, about 2% is a good amount. It's fiery enough. Yes, we are going to save this onto our stories. If it saves, I really hope it does, because sometimes it crashes. Would you recommend to oxygenate on your first ferment and not just on your starter or SCOBY? Yes, definitely. And I think it's really important, especially if you're brewing in sort of tall, skinnier tanks. We've seen a lot of brewers that are using wine fermentation tanks. Those Italian stainless steel ones are really beautiful. They fit really nicely in a brewery because they're tall and skinny. The problem with those is that the bacteria, is probably many of you already know, tends to sit at the top because that's where the oxygen is. And the bacteria proliferate when there's exposure to oxygen. So in those tall, skinny tanks, you don't have the same distribution of bacteria throughout the whole vessel. So the best way of doing that is oxygenating that kombucha as much as possible, and that's either by putting the aquarium pump in there, or getting like a kayak paddle, as we used to do, and manually stir that kombucha every single day. Agitate the liquid, get the oxygen in there, speed up the bacteria growth, minimize the yeast growth. Yes, oxygenating your primary ferment is definitely a good thing to do. I would recommend that you do it as much as you can, but again, it's down to the speed at which you want your kombucha to brew, the temperature that you're brewing at, the makeup of bacteria and yeast. It's going to be totally different and unique to every single person's brew. So what I would initially do is, as I mentioned, message me. I'll send you through those links to the aquarium pumps. And you can find one that works for you. I don't think they're too expensive, but you can test it out just to see, you know, which works for you. Have we done a hard kombucha? We have done a hard kombucha before. I don't like that wording, hard kombucha. You know, in the States, we used to have a thing called Mike's Hard Lemonade, and it's like this bro drink. I don't know what else you'd call it, but yeah, alcoholic kombucha is interesting. There's some recipes online for how to do it. Pretty easy, actually. You want to get some champagne yeast. You can do beer yeast, but champagne yeast is actually a little nicer, a little bit more delicate. And you do a standard ferment, and then you can add more sugar and do it in a closed environment with some champagne yeast at maybe 30 degrees for 5 days. And you can turn it into like 7 to 12% ABV kombucha. So you got to be careful though, because you can produce something called ethyl aldehyde in addition to higher levels of alcohol, which you don't really want in your body. So you need to let that condition for a while afterwards and settle out. But yeah, alcoholic kombucha is interesting. I think we're going to see a lot more brands popping up here in Europe over the next couple years. When I was in LA last, there's so many alcoholic kombucha brands, and they're really, really good. Some of them don't even taste alcoholic, which is crazy because they're like 7%. But it's interesting. How to ferment in corny kegs on a commercial level. So you wouldn't necessarily want to ferment in corny kegs, but you would want to carbonate in corny kegs. So one quick point for early stage brewers out there, a lot of people ask, how do I scale up from 8-liter glass jars? I don't know if I already said this earlier on. 8-liter glass jars to like large 1,000-liter stainless fermentation tanks. I would recommend not doing that. And this is what we did initially, and we fucked up. Like, it was a pain in the ass to jump from sort of 8-liter glass jars to 2,000-liter stainless steel tanks, because our SCOBY, our bacteria, our yeast, they just weren't ready for that jump. We didn't have enough of it. So what I'd recommend you do is you don't need to invest in just stainless steel or glass. There are other materials that you can brew kombucha in, and that are scientifically proven to not leach chemicals. One of them is HDPE, high density polyurethane ethylene. I'm not exactly sure, but HPDE tanks. And we were brewing in these up until we moved our brewery to Belgium. Now we're brewing in those big tanks. But I know a bunch of big brands like Hum Kombucha use custom designed HDPE tanks. They cost a lot less. They can withstand 60 times the acidity of kombucha. They're used for storing chemicals. They can store industrial vinegar. And these are those sort of blue, they're like a bright blue kind of tank. You can buy them on Amazon. You can get them from different chemical supply shops. They have these tanks. They have white ones, they have different colored ones, and you can get like 20-liter ones, you can get 40-liter, 60-liter, 80-liter, 100-liter, 200-liter. You can get variations of them that are a bit wider and squatter. And as we know, kombucha is best fermented in a vessel that is wide and shallow, because that means more bacteria can go from the top to the bottom more efficiently. So it speeds up the process. It keeps the alcohol levels down. So you can get HDPE tanks that are way cheaper. I mean, we're talking like, I don't know, like 30, 40 pounds for one of these things instead of 1,000, 2,000 pounds. So you can slowly grow up in that way. So I'd recommend looking into HDPE tanks. How long do you leave your fruit juice in before getting the product filtered and bottled? Good question. So I'll talk from the perspective of what we were doing in London for a period of time, but we would take our finished kombucha, and then we would pump it into a bright tank, and then we would take our juice and we'd pump that into the bright tank, and we'd let that sit for anywhere between 24 to 48 hours. The longer you let it sit, the more of that juice binds with the acidity. I'm not exactly sure what happens, but there's some process by which the fruit juice just binds into the liquid, and you hold on to more flavor. And then we would filter after that, because as we know, the fruit juice also contains yeast. So if you are filtering your kombucha, then the juice itself needs to go through that process in addition to the primary ferment, the kombucha itself. So yeah, 24 to 48 hours, chilled as low as possible, will allow that to sort of enough of that to hold on. And if If it's still not strong enough after filtration, you can either leave it for longer, or you can just use more juice, and hopefully that will stick. Let's see, can you pump warm kombucha into a bright tank? Yeah, you can definitely pump warm kombucha into a bright tank, but you're going to have to chill it down in order for it to be effective. It's nothing bad's going to happen necessarily, but it will just take longer. It depends as well if it's filtered or not. I guess I know this is Valley Isle kombucha, which by the way is one of the best kombuchas in the world. It's brewed on Maui in Hawaii, and it's just so good. They ship across the states if anybody's tuning in here. It's really good stuff. But I know that yours is unfiltered, so pumping warm kombucha into a bright tank, there is a concern if you leave it warm for too long without turning on your glycol chilling system, that it would, produce a little bit more alcohol. But I guess turning on that glycol chilling unit would crash it down quick enough, probably. Do we pasteurize our kombucha? No, we do not pasteurize our bottles, but we did do a run of cans that we did pasteurize. And we did that through a tunnel pasteurizer that was a really low temperature. I think it was something like 65 degrees. So it didn't have an adverse effect on flavor. We tested these cans in the market and they just didn't really work for us. We're going to look later down the line at doing cans again, but cans are an interesting one. If anyone here is canned kombucha or is looking to can kombucha, again, like our friends at Nunk, this stuff is amazing. If you're canning kombucha or if you have canned kombucha, you probably know that it's a serious pain in the ass. But it is the best thing you can do for the environment. And it just makes things a lot easier. It's cheaper, generally speaking. They weigh less. The transport costs are lower. You can get it into more places. But number one issue is that when we were initially looking to can, no canning companies would do it for us because most canning companies in the UK can beer. And the moment we said, oh yeah, we're making kombucha, we're putting that in can, they're like, nope, not interested, because Acetobacter, the main bacteria in kombucha that produces the acetic acid, arguably the most important strain of bacteria in kombucha, if it gets into a beer ferment, it will completely destroy entire batches. Even if it's in the ambient air, if you're brewing kombucha in a beer brewery and somehow it gets into the tank, it can destroy entire batches. So if there's even a small amount of Acetobacter in a canning line and that gets into a beer, it can fuck up the whole process. So a lot of people won't even touch kombucha because they're making all their money from canning beer. So if you can find someone brave enough to can your kombucha for you, it will need to be pasteurized or filtered most of the time. Also, cans can explode. I'll be honest, our first run of cans, we finally got a beer brewery up north, in the north of England, to do it for us. And they told us they properly sterilized their lines. Turns out they hadn't. There was some beer yeast still in the line. 2 weeks of the day, all of our cans, about 500 of them in an incubator, started exploding. And if anybody's had an exploding can or bottle before, you know what a nightmare it is, not only to clean up, but it just takes you straight back to square one. So you just need to be aware of the fact that cans are more fragile. And also, if you're going to fill your can yourself, you need to do it in a sterile environment. You need to use a 2% parasitic acid solution in order to make sure there's no airborne yeast. There's yeast everywhere. There's yeast in this room I'm in. There's yeast wherever you are. It's a beauty of a lot of ferments, but if you get the wrong yeast into a can or bottle that you're trying to make shelf stable, it's going to screw up the whole process. If not, is cold chain necessary for distribution and retail? Yes. So that's a good point. Another reason why we recommend that people filter their kombucha, not only for safety and consistency considerations, but also because there's just not cold chain distribution in most countries. In the States, there is. And a lot of the kombucha brands in America, like Health-Ade and GTs, the bigger ones, need to be kept refrigerated, but they have their own trucks. I mean, these guys are turning over hundreds of millions of dollars a year, so they have their own fleet of refrigerated, vehicles that travel across the United States and deliver their product. But if you're looking here in the UK, and this is from our experience, we started filtering because we had no other option. We reached a point at which we had maxed out all of our cold chain distribution networks here in the UK. And the majority of them were natural food distributors. If you're tuning in from a small country or a place where there's maybe not much refrigerated transport. Look for people that are distributing milk in your area locally. Milk always needs to be refrigerated. That's one of the few things. And there's always milk distributors somewhere in the world, hopefully in your area. And that's a good partner initially to work with, because you know that product needs to be kept cold at all times, generally speaking below 5 degrees Celsius. So for us, we got to a point where we were no longer able to grow because the bigger wholesalers we were talking to, mainly in the on-trade, we're talking restaurants, cafes, bars, hotels, they don't distribute cold products. They put them in vans. Thankfully the UK is a reasonably cold country, so it doesn't get super hot. Like I know some of the brewers that we're in contact with are in India, and I mean, the temperatures up there, 40, 45 degrees. It's crazy. So filtration is the only way to safely get your product at scale to your customer. It was a tough decision, but we did a blind taste test, and I couldn't tell which one was filtered and not, and I was the one that was resistant to it initially. So it's interesting when you look at a product that's clear versus a product that's cloudy, your mind tells you that the one that's cloudy tastes better. But if you put a blindfold over your eyes and you taste those side by side, as long as they're brewed properly, they actually don't taste that much different. So food grade plastic, is it okay for fermentation? It is. HDPE, make sure it's certified HDPE, and that can withstand 60 times the acidity of kombucha, as I said earlier. Where are you at regarding secondary ferment flavoring with full fruit herbs rather than juice? It's just a pain in the ass sort of to use plant matter. Juice is more to the point. If you're really trying to optimize your brewing procedures, you want to use juice. But you can still get a lot of flavor from chopped up fruit or herbs if you're brewing on a small scale. Again, our friends at Nunk, I'm not exactly sure how Andrew's doing it, but I would assume there's some kind of maybe cold brewing of you might want to reach out to him to ask, because he uses herbs and very successfully. This is so tasty. So maybe check in with him or brewers that are using that. We've never used herbs before, so I'm not sure. We used to oxygenate our starter, but not your batch. What changed? When I oxygenate mine, it doesn't taste the same. So good point. Originally, we would only oxygenate our starter liquid. And that's because the tank that we used, which again, if you're just tuning in, I will send the PDF to you and you can make one yourself or understand how it works. It's so good at producing non-alcoholic, super acidic, bacteria-rich starter liquid that we didn't actually need to oxygenate our primary ferment. It was not something we did. We would remove the cellulose, but there was enough in there, and it was non-alcoholic enough that in 7 to 10 days, it would produce exactly what we wanted. Nowadays, because we're doing full closed ferments, we are oxygenating constantly. But again, it's down to you testing out what works for you. Oxygenating consistently in a primary ferment might change the flavor of your kombucha. It's a good point. So maybe do some side-by-side, test them out, and see what you prefer. But if you have a starter tank that is producing starter liquid that is potent enough in terms of bacteria, acidity, and is non-alcoholic, then it can actually be strong enough that you don't actually need to oxygenate your primary ferment. But again, it's up to you. It's totally different for everyone. Should first fermentation not be done in corny kegs? No. First fermentation should be done in a tank, and then generally speaking, you carbonate in a corny keg. I mean, I guess theoretically you can ferment in a corny keg if you want, but there's just a small opening, so you don't really have enough exposure to oxygen in there. And you want to be able to see what's sort of going on. Well, you don't have to, but it's nice to be able to see a little bit better if you're brewing on a scale that small. Question here, filtration or pasteurization, which is better to prolong the shelf life? Okay, I'll break it down in a completely honest and transparent way. Pasteurization will always be easier. It's quicker, it's more effective, it does exactly the same thing as filtration. Filtration sounds a little bit better. It rolls off the tongue a little bit better. If somebody says, do you pasteurize your kombucha? You say, no, we filter. And that's, although when you look at the liquid under a microscope or you test it, or even if you taste it, between a pasteurized kombucha and a filtered kombucha, there's really no noticeable difference. What you've done is you've removed the living microorganisms from your product. And And like I said, on a commercial scale, that's a decision that you're going to have to make yourself. But they do the same thing. Pasteurization is just a word that doesn't sound very good. And there are nicer ways of pasteurizing. You can find a way of pasteurizing at a lower temperature, which does not have an adverse effect on flavor. And the simple fact of it is you're trying to stop the yeast from producing further alcohol. And if there is bacteria left in your kombucha, which I've already said this a million times, but doesn't actually have any benefit on your gut health, that's down to science. If anybody wants to refute that or have a conversation, hit me up. Let's do it. I'll send you the studies. But the bacteria, the yeast does give a level of mouthfeel. It gives that body, that texture, a little bit of cloudiness. So if you pasteurize, you can actually still retain some of that level of sort of texture and fullness, but it's going to be sort of dead yeast. It really depends, though, how you do it. And I'm not an expert on pasteurization. There are definitely some people out there that will know more than me. I'm not sure who that is, but filtration is a roundabout way of doing the same thing. It's costly, it's time consuming, and it is not always consistent. You need to not only invest in these pieces of kit, but you need to either really, really clean your filter cartridges or whatever you're using regularly, thoroughly, and make sure they're sterile. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. Like one mishap, one cleaning procedure missed, and suddenly you've got residual yeast in your batch, and you've got to throw away loads of bottles. And I'll be completely honest with you, we have had to throw away thousands of bottles. A couple of years ago, we had an infection of yeast in about 10,000 bottles. Guess what we had to do? Pour them out. We not only had to pour them out, we had to hire people to pour them out. So we didn't have to pay for the labor. We had to pay for the loss of liquid, and it's horrible. So I don't want to stop anybody from filtering, because actually it works really well once you get a flow down. And if you have any more specific questions about filtration, you can message me directly, because there's various ways you can do it. It really depends on your type of kit, the scale that you're brewing, how much money you want to invest. Commercial canned kombucha, I've tried, tastes like vinegar. I've tried a lot of commercial canned kombucha, and I've never had one that tastes like vinegar. Some great ones in the States. Is HDPE temperature resistant? Since we'll be pouring in hot tea. It is temperature resistant, yeah. So that's totally safe. There's no problem there. Do you have any information if the beneficial acids pass through the filters and get retained? Good question. Yes, the beneficial acids will remain. Those do not get destroyed. Even if you pasteurize, the beneficial acids remain, most notably the acetic acid. Sorry, my nose is very itchy. Yeah, that is one of the primary benefits of kombucha is derived from the acetic acid. And for those of you who aren't aware of it, acetic acid is what gives that vinegar flavor. According to studies, and they've done scientific research on acetic acid, but I must note that not specifically on humans, but they have, there's one study where they basically gave people slices of bread, and then they had them eat the bread, and then they tested their blood sugar. And then they had some people eat the bread, have some acetic acid, and then they tested their blood sugar. And what they found was the people that had acetic acid after eating this slice of bread, which was rich in carbohydrates, they found that their blood sugar didn't spike as much. So it actually can help you regulate the sugar levels in your blood. It also can help break down carbohydrates, proteins, aids in digestion. It's good to have early in the morning. Anyways, the benefits of acetic acid, you can look that up. How do you suggest we clean the HDPE tanks used for primary fermentation? If you're brewing on a bigger scale, you probably want to invest in some cleaning chemicals. Peracetic acid is what we use. We use a 2% solution to clean things. You need to wear eyewear. You need to have gloves on. If this stuff gets into contact with your eyes, your skin, it's not fun. And then for our larger scale pieces of kit, like bright tanks, and stuff like that, you want to use something like caustic soda. That's even more gnarly. So if you get it on your skin, it gets all soapy and it literally burns off your skin. So you gotta be real careful with these chemicals. If you're brewing at home on a smaller scale, you can just use spirit vinegar or boiling water. But when you get to a larger scale, you do need to invest in these in these sort of chemical compounds, which are safe, by the way, and they're, they don't get into your final brew. So it's important to note that you're not putting some like toxic stuff in your brew. What's the easiest way of moving kombucha from tanks to corny kegs? Would you use the same hoses? What we would do is we would just attach a hose to our tank, and we would just tip the corny keg underneath and use gravity to put it through. Otherwise, it depends on the type of kit that you have. If you have a large tank or a smaller tank, you can do it by hand. Corny kegs are only 19 liters generally. So doing it by hand is just as easy, like getting in there, scooping up a big jug, pouring it directly in. That's probably the easiest way of doing it. But if you have a big tank and you can pump it in, then I would do that. Some kind of pump that you can take liquid from your tank and put it right in the corny keg. Before bottling, do I need a CO2 mixer equipment or mix CO2 with the kombucha in the bright tank will do? Well, there's different types of different ways of carbonating. You can either get a bright tank, or if you don't have a tank that can hold carbonation, you can get an inline carbonator, and those work just as well. We've never used one, but it's probably easier and might even save you some money. I don't exactly know how they work, but inline carbonation means that just as the liquid goes from your tank into bottle, it's just carbed in the process, so that you don't have to worry about allowing that liquid to carbonate overnight, crash chilling it, all that kind of stuff. But in order for it to carbonate efficiently, it still does need to be below 5 degrees, ideally as close to 1 degree as possible. The colder the liquid, the easier it is for CO2 to get into it. Most of you probably already know this, but you can't carbonate a warm kombucha. You need to chill it down as low as possible. If you can get it down to 5 degrees, that's fine. But again, in the early days when we would use corny kegs, when we had like 100 of them, we would, and our fridge only went down to 5 degrees. Actually, at one point it only went down to like 7 or 8 degrees. So, and this is when we did not filter. So we put the liquid in there, we put it in the fridge overnight, get it to 7 degrees, pump it with CO2, shake it. It would take us like 3 days to get carbonated kombucha. So the lower the temperature, the more efficiently your kombucha is going to get carbonated if you're pumping it with CO2. So remember that. You don't want to try and carbonate warm kombucha. It's a pain in the ass. Let's see here. After filtration, the kombucha can the kombucha be kept at room temperature? How long can it last? 1 year. Again, this is something you're going to have to determine, and also it depends on the level of filtration. You can't say a kombucha is ambient or shelf stable unless it's filtered sterile, because even if there's, if you're doing if you're going down to 1 micron, you're still going to have some bacteria left. You're going to remove almost all the yeast, but there'll still be some bacteria which can interact with the sugar and create some different flavors. So if you want it to be fully shelf stable, you got to make it sterile. Otherwise, you could probably filter it to 1 micron and like the shelf life ambient would be a short period of time, but I'm not quite sure how that would work. And testing this, you would have to send it into a laboratory, and they'll do incubation tests to ensure that your kombucha does not change over time. But really what you want to make sure of is that the flavor doesn't degrade. If you're putting an extended shelf life on there, you can speed up that process by building an at-home incubation space with like insulation and like a space heater or something like that. You can look up on YouTube how to make an incubator. A lot of home brewers would do that, and we had one in our fermentation room. We now do that on a much bigger scale with Duvel. But really you want to send it to a lab, because the most important thing is determining that there's no alcohol, determining that there's no yeast that you don't want, that no other compounds have formed, and then eventually you need to make sure that it tastes good, like a sensory test. If you're pasteurizing, why brew in kombucha and not add the acids to the tea? So yeah, that's an interesting one, and I'm biased here. This is my personal opinion. I do not, and listen, I'm not a purist. Like clearly, we filter our kombucha, but we still brew it. We still brew it for 10 days, the old-fashioned way: tea, water, sugar, and a SCOBY. 4 ingredients. That is all you need for kombucha. You don't need to put in all these fancy things. I'm not a purist when it comes to the finished product, but I am a bit of a purist when it comes to the process of brewing. And I personally, and this is not necessarily on behalf of JAR, but and not to hate on any brands that do this, but personally, I'm not a fan of calling something kombucha if you're just taking acid and mixing it with sweet tea, because you can do that in a day and you can make a soft drink. But it's not a fermented beverage if only one part of that drink is fermented. So what I'm saying is that I think it's important to allow the sweet tea to interact with a living culture of bacteria and yeast and starter liquid for a period of time. And that period of time is up to anybody, but generally I found, and we found over the years, that you need a minimum of 5 days to get a complex flavor. I know there's one big brand in the States, who I won't name, that ferments for like 2 or 3 days. I don't know how they do that, but you can tell that their kombucha has more tea flavor, it's more sweet, it's less acidic, and you will find that, there's some people selling some acid out there, like acid. They're selling starter liquid, and then asking people to pair that with sweet tea and call it a kombucha. For me, that's not a proper kombucha, and I'd recommend maybe testing it out though, doing the taste test side by side. But ferment your kombucha. That's the whole point of it. It's a unique fermented drink. It's not just a soft drink. It's not made like Coca-Cola like that. Anyways, that's just my 2 cents. That's just my personal opinion. It's not gospel. Do we ever filter your yeast from the starter before making a new starter, or before adding the starter for fermentation 1? There's a lot of starter things in here. We do not filter from the starter before making the new starter. No, we when making the starter liquid, everything's unfiltered. The whole process for us in the brewing is completely unfiltered until it goes into bottle. So during the fermentation process, unfiltered living microorganisms prior to bottling, filter that out for stability and safety. So and consistency. So that's sort of our thing. How do you recommend to CIP the sterile filters, hot water and parasitic? Yeah, that's a good question. So we're getting into more technical questions here with regards to commercial scaling and filters. Yes, hot water and parasitic. I'd recommend you get a microscope. I mean, we bought one for 80 pounds on eBay, and you can do like a swab and you can test that. And if there's any yeast still left in your filter cartridges, then you got a problem. So they need to be completely sterile. And it depends on the type that you're using. Like if you're using a plate filter, you have single use like 50p per sheet filters. If you're using a 40 by 40, that adds up if you're doing several brews a week or a brew a day. It's an expensive process. Those you throw away, but then when you get to a PAL, PALL, sort of cartridge filter, which is what we used, that is something you want to clean those, because they're very expensive. I mean, we're talking like a couple £100 per cartridge. So again, filtration is expensive. It's time consuming. It's a bit risky because you got to make sure that you're properly sterilizing, but it's worth it in the end. And we do prefer to filter rather than pasteurize. Would you say kombucha is the same sort of process as making kefir? To be honest, I don't know too much about kefir. I know it has bacteria and yeast, and it's more volatile, so it ferments a lot more quickly. It's much more difficult to make a kefir that's non-alcoholic. There's some excellent ones out there in the UK. You should check out Agua de Madre. They're based in Hackney. Pure Earth Water Kefir. The London Fermentary, who our former head brewer Matt Hoyle is head of production for. There's some great kefir out there, so check it out. Might want to reach out to them with regards to questions about that. But kombucha is a longer process. It's not as, from what I understand, it's not as fast as kefir. Kefir is like a day, 2 days, 3 days. Kombucha is, a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depends. Would you class filtered kombucha as raw? GT's Still says raw on the label. Just wondering if they filter or pasteurize. Oh, okay. This is an interesting one. So GT's is raw kombucha. I mean, I think. I don't 100% know how he does it, but I'll share some insights that I suspect. He has two lines. He has his Synergy line and he has his Classic line. The Classic line is 0.5% or above. So that kombucha is brewed in the same way you brew at home with a SCOBY, completely unfiltered, and for that reason, it can be alcoholic. So he has to pay tax on that in the US. You have to be 21 years old to buy that kombucha. It's the best though. Honestly, GT's Classic line, his original, it's the benchmark, in my opinion. It's incredible. If you can get your hands on some, or go to America and get some, it's in Canada and Mexico as well, I think. It's next level. It's incredible. His Synergy line is the line that's sold here in the UK. If you look on the back of that, there is a bespoke type of yeast that he has designed. I think it's patented. So he has a type of yeast that we've never seen before anywhere, and nobody else can use it. It was designed, I believe, in 2010, when some of you may know, all of the kombucha was taken off the shelves in supermarkets across the United States when a person from the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, I've spoken about this before, in America, for some reason, all of those things are one department. And he received a report of a fizzing bottle of kombucha in a Whole Foods in Vermont. And it turns out that kombucha was 2.5% alcohol. So they removed all the kombucha from the shelves. A lot of brands went bust. About 80% of them went bust. A couple of them reformulated. GT's was one of them. He spent 3 months with lab technicians and scientists developing a strain of yeast that does not produce alcohol. That's what I understand. But I don't know how he brews that. I think it's still raw. Raw kombucha is, in my opinion, I wouldn't consider our kombucha raw. We don't use that in our wording. If any process has been applied to the kombucha, I wouldn't be able to say that it's raw. It's still kombucha. It's still properly fermented, authentically fermented, classically brewed, whatever you want to say. It just is. It doesn't have the living microorganisms in it, which we've talked about in terms of the benefits of that. The flavor profile is a benefit, but in terms of the health benefits, it's not really necessary to have an unfiltered kombucha. Why do you have to carbonate if natural CO2 occurs in fermentation too? Again, carbonation is so that your kombucha doesn't become alcoholic in a secondary fermentation. If you're brewing at a commercial scale, you know that when you add fruit juice or you add sugar to prime your kombucha in a secondary fermentation, excess ethanol is produced and your kombucha will become boozy. And then you got a problem if you're selling it commercially. You got to be able to, ideally, you want to be able to sell this to people who don't drink or people under the age of 18 or 21, depending on where you live in the world. So 0.5 microns, is that enough for shelf stability? Yes, 0.45 microns is considered sterile filtration. So yes, what level of filtration is your final filtration before bottling? 0.45 microns. That is sterile filtration. If it's done properly, that will remove everything. So how can I get the PDF you talked about earlier? If anybody's just tuned in, just email me. I've said it a million times in this. You're probably tired of hearing me, and I'm tired of hearing my own voice. Adam@jarkombucha.com. Send me an email. I will send you through the spec for the acetator, which has loads of really good information on there, so that you don't have to buy acid from anybody. You can make your own in-house. That's the cool part. You're going to save money. You're going to save time. You're going to learn some new skills. And that's the whole purpose of this. We're trying to share as much information as possible. I want to be able to share this knowledge, and so that people don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops, pay huge consultancy fees, pay for all this stuff when you can do a lot of it yourself. Let's see, the difference in process between brewing, fermenting tea-based kombucha versus coffee-based kombucha. I've never made a coffee kombucha. Well, actually, no, we did experiment with one batch. From what I can remember, it grew mold because the beans hadn't been steamed. So if you're making coffee kombucha, I guess you can do it in different ways. You can either make an original kombucha, unflavored, add coffee to it, carbonate it, do it that way. Or you can use coffee beans and use that as tea. but they need to be steamed prior to that, so because they contain bacteria and stuff that can grow mold. So personally, I'm not a fan of coffee kombucha. I don't think the flavors work very well, and I think it's a bit too niche. Because kombucha is already very niche, but adding coffee to the mix, it's like either coffee or kombucha. I mean, people don't normally combine the two. Equinox makes one, which is actually the tastiest I've tried, so it'd be worth testing theirs out. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure how it works. Why did we move to Belgium? We moved to Belgium because we partnered up with 2wnYf23N5v7ShOTy, a Belgian brewery, and they built us a sort of state-of-the-art custom facility over there. And our goal is to expand across continental Europe, so that's sort of our plan for the end of this year and early next year, is launching in Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain. We've launched in Portugal already. We're going to launch in the Czech Republic. So producing everything in Belgium. Also, with Brexit happening, we don't want to have to export all of our kombucha across Europe from the UK and, take on these duties. We're importing our kombucha right now from Belgium to the UK, which, might have some effect. But for all of you guys in continental Europe, you're safe in terms of that. I'm just going to answer a couple more here because I think I've been on here for a while. It doesn't have a time. I'm not sure why. So if you pasteurize your kombucha, you're not able to call it raw, or is it simply not filtered? I don't know. I mean, I would recommend you go onto KBI's codes of practices and take a look at what they have on there, but I don't necessarily agree with everything they say. It's really up to you how you designate your kombucha. If you're brewing commercially, you might want to speak to your local health and safety center or food health and safety. I'm not sure what it's called in other parts of the world, but they could probably give you a phone just told me I have low battery. They'll probably give you a definition of what you can and cannot say on your bottle, but I wouldn't be able to in good faith say that a kombucha is raw if it is pasteurized or filtered as it's gone through some process, if that makes sense. It's still kombucha. I still would call it kombucha. It's just maybe not raw kombucha. What if after the first fermentation you use an oxygenation one and then do a secondary fermentation, will it still produce alcohol? Yes, anytime there's excess sugar in yeast in a closed environment, alcohol will be produced. So just stay away from the secondary fermentation. A lot of people get obsessed with it, but from my perspective, if you're trying to brew commercially, it's really too risky. It's just not worth it. You get the same level of carbonation. You're putting the same thing in there. You're putting CO2 in there, which is produced naturally. You might get a finer bubble if you do it in a secondary fermentation, but it's really not worth the hassle of a recall, exploding bottles, getting children drunk in the worst circumstance. You're giving kombucha to a family member or someone's buying it for their kid because it's healthier than Coca-Cola, and suddenly it's boozy. That is not cool. So the main thing, keep that kombucha non-alcoholic if you are selling commercially, unless you specifically state on the bottle that is a higher alcohol, and you have to pay tax for that. So okay, let's see. I'm just going to go through a couple of these. What are your top 3 tips for scaling, bottling process, fermentation process, branding? That's a big question. I don't think I have time to answer all that, but if you email me after this, I can pass on some of that. What do you guys flavor in corny? How would you guys flavor in corny kegs to avoid clogging of lines? Just pour the juice in with the kombucha into a corny keg, which is what we used to do. You still get a bit of gunk if it's unfiltered, but generally speaking, it works fine, and you can easily unclog the ports on top of your corny kegs. When you say proper made, you're talking about cleaning the filtration system properly, right pressure, or have some more details involved. To be honest, I don't have the details on how we clean our filters. And the filters that we're using nowadays in Belgium are on an industrial scale, so they're much different. But you will need to have high pressure for sure in order to blast off as much of the yeast and stuff as possible. And then you will want to soak those filters in a 2% parasitic acid solution in a tub of some kind, ideally an HDPE tub or something like that. And you soak them for a period of time. I don't recall how long we used to do that for, but pressure, hot water, parasitic acid to clean cartridge filters. How long is the shelf life of jar in a glass bottle? At the time of production, it's 18 months. By the time it gets to the consumer, it's at least 12 months, but generally speaking, we run through those in less than 6. you will be launching the Czech Republic. Yes, we're speaking to some wholesalers out there now. So what should be the right amount of sugar? It's the last one, so that it does not convert into alcohol. I mean, that's difficult to say, but as I mentioned earlier in the chat, you probably don't want to use more than 60 grams of sugar per liter in order to brew. The less sugar that's left over, the better. But again, if you're worrying about alcohol, don't do the secondary ferment. Carbonate your kombucha. If you're doing it in small batches, SodaStream. Slightly bigger batches, corny kegs. Slightly bigger batches, bright tanks. So anyways, I think that covers a lot of it. Again, if you guys have any questions, email me at adam@jarkombucha.com. And I've got that PDF on the acetator. So you can thank Matt Hoyle for that one. And hopefully this should help a lot of you guys looking for answers to oxygenation, to producing starter liquid. Maybe you can even follow this exact spec and make your own. I would show this to an engineer if you are a larger brewery looking to scale up and looking to produce some equipment. You can buy these acetators. Germany has some great ones. Cetotech is a brand. If you've got the big bucks, those are 50 grand, 100 grand, 500 grand, depending on the size. And the breweries that use them are like Remedy in Australia. They're also in the UK now. Hum Kombucha, Health Aid Kombucha, they all have a Cetotech. They've spent like over 100 grand on these pieces of kit. The thing I'm sending you cost us, the stainless steel tank that we bought, I think was 1,200 pounds. And then Matt put in probably a couple grand. So I think in total it cost about 3,500, 4,000 maybe, to have the whole thing made, including his time. So it's totally up to you how you do it, but send me an email. I will send through that to you. Also, if you have any further questions about anything that I talked about, just let me know. So yeah, much love to all you guys around the world. I feel so just blessed to be able to connect with so many different people from around the world. Kombucha is such an incredible industry that brings people from everywhere. I mean, honestly, I've spoken to people on every single continent apart from Antarctica, I think. So yeah, let's keep in touch. Feel free to message at any time, whether that's on Instagram or on email. That's the whole point. Let's keep the love. Let's keep the communication. Let's keep the transparency. Let's make this industry like craft beer brewing. Let's make this industry like coffee, knowledge sharing, support, and yeah. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. Hope this answered some of your questions. And yeah, see you guys soon. Bye.